Thank you so much, Jeremy and Charlotte, for having me. And welcome to the first panel, Receptions Outside the Box. So, as stated previously, my name is Amanda. Hello. And I want to say salve and come state to everyone in Italy right now. I saw some Italians in the chat too. As a joy, I have to do that. Our first presenter is Evan, and Evan, I may pronounce your surname incorrectly because I don't speak German. Schultes? Is that correct? Schulteis? Oh, I'm sorry, mi dispiace, I'm sorry. Evan Schulteis is a graduate student at Winthrop University, pursuing a Master's of Arts in History with a thesis on reconstructing Byzantine military equipment. He has published one book entitled The Battle of Catalaunian Fields, AD 451, multiple articles for Ancient Warfare, and is also a degreed and published chemist with expertise in graphene supercapacitors. His field of expertise include Roman military studies, Roman military archaeology, and their related fields in Roman culture, social history, political history, and economic history, with a focus on late antiquity and middle Byzantine periods. So Evan's paper for this panel is Claws Up, Asses Down. That's the way we break down the reception and presentation of classical themes in metalcore. Now, Evan, without further ado, let's leave it to you. It's up to you. Take it from here.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, first, let me explain the title with my background image. So, because I'm sure some of you are wondering about that, this is the band Attack Attack, which is what the reference to the title is. If you do not know, it is a crabcore band famous for making crab walking stances within the metalcore genre. With that being said, let me jump into my paper. Metalcore is a fusion genre born out of the hardcore and crust punk peak of the mid-1990s. Incorporating the common themes of anti-establishment social political commentary and a rejection of the mainstream inherent to the punk philosophy with the transgressive visual and auditory elements of extreme metal. Many songs within the metalcore genre borrow directly from Greek mythology. In particular, the work of bands like Trivium or Alesana, who's rearranged these stories into direct or interpretive retellings, or that of bands like Era, whose lyrics examine the fundamental themes buried within some classical myths rather than retell the tales themselves. This presentation aims to look at the incorporation of classical themes, topics, and mythology, and their presentation through the lens of the genre as it evolved out of the hyper-masculine roots of the mid-90s heavy hardcore and early metalcore into the scene subculture, which originated as a reactionary movement against the widespread misogyny of the hardcore subculture, and into the modern day. This presentation will both search for the utilization of classical themes as a rejection of mainstream culture and authority in metalcore's rendition of the punk philosophy, as well as discuss the complicated issue of the use of classical mythology as both a rejection of and a presentation of misogyny within the metalcore genre, particularly third wave metalcore, sometimes derogatorily referred to as cringecore for this reason. Finally, this presentation will also discuss the issues of the Christcore subgenre and its use of both classical themes and Christian mythology by bands such as The Devil Wears Prada and As I Lay Dying, as a presentation of moral decay during the peak of the American evangelical movement in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It would be impossible to detail every song that incorporates classical mythology in one overview. Therefore, this paper will focus on 3 songs that characterize the usage of classical or pre-modern themes in 3 songs by the bands Alesana, The Devil Wears Prada, and Era. These 3 songs, Ambrosia, Number 3, Never Forget, and Andromeda, sorry, my Latin habits are getting in the way there, look at 3 different approaches to the use of classical mythology in the metalcore genre. Ambrosia takes a direct approach, adapting the classical myth of King Midas into lyrical format. Andromeda is an embodiment of the fundamental themes of metalcore and the scene, with a feminist and anti-authoritarian message characteristic of the genre. Finally, number 3, Never Forget, is a Christcore song that emphasizes the intertwining of the genre with the American evangelical movement of the late 2000s, but also expresses a rejection of mainstream evangelism through a surprising awareness of Gnostic magical texts and Orthodox doctrine. Alesana formed in 2004 in Raleigh, North Carolina, taking influence from a range of metalcore, post-hardcore, and pop-punk bands, including, for example, Between the Buried and Me and Smashing Pumpkins. Their first album, On Frail Wings of Vanity and Wax, borrows heavily from Greek mythology, including the story of Icarus and Daedalus, which is influenced directly in the title. The songs of the album include several direct adaptations of classical myth or history, the most prominent of them being Ambrosia, Nero's Decay, and The Third Temptation of Paris. Accompanying the song Ambrosia was a music video featuring the band in outfits derived from the early 2000s pop punk fashion, like in My Chemical Romance's Helena music video. The band and the primary characters of the video's story are set in the stereotypical outdoor setting that was characteristic of 2000s metalcore music videos, specifically in a flower garden. The video features a modern young couple in which the man is handed a rose which promptly turns the entire garden to gold, which the woman then leaves, resulting in the man drowning in golden mud, vomiting rose petals until he dies. And I'll show this at the end of my talk if there's time. Alesana takes the story of King Midas and transforms it into a song of rejection and modern heartbreak through a mix of lyrical and visual imagery. While there is much to be said about the nice guy trope in the visual imagery, a problem characteristic of the late 2000s and early 2010s metalcore genre, the adaptation of Midas' story is clear. The man's greed turns the garden to gold and causes the woman to leave him, upon which he thrashes about in muddy water until he drowns in his own rose petals. In the original myth of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Midas gains the power as a gift for his hospitality to a satyr and turns his rose garden to gold, testing the power, only to discover he will starve to death thanks to his gift. A later version of the tale from 1852 by Nathaniel Hawthorne has his daughter come to him and complains of the loss of the scent and the hardness of the roses, upon which, touching her, Midas turns his beloved into gold. In Hyginus' version, he prays to Dionysus, who relents and instructs him to wash in the Patroclus River, imbuing it with his power and turning the sands to gold, upon which Midas then becomes a servant of Pan and leads a humble rustic life. Hawthorne's bastardized version is the most well-known and the basis for Alesana's song, but differs in that the female character has been changed to a lover and in its ending with the man's death. The tale of Midas is not the only reference to Midas and Ambrosia, however, as the lyrics themselves espouse fate wields its knife to cut the thread, a reference to Alexander and the Gordian knot, which in some versions was allegedly tied by Midas, who founded the city of Gordian. The lyrics themselves reinforce the nice guy theme found in the video, with phrases such as, "Have I not earned this gift of beauty within? How selfish were the gods to keep these riches from my rightful treasure." The man in the song, however, takes revenge on the woman by intentionally turning her to gold, or diverging from the video, and then ordering fate to cut the thread and end his life. Ambrosia is emblematic of the paradoxical nature of the metalcore and post-hardcore genres, and particularly the scene itself, where despite its claims in rejecting misogyny, the bands that enchanted its members were themselves espousing highly misogynistic narratives. As a more anti-authoritarian and feminist narrative emerges in bands that ironically appeal much less to a female audience. Where bands like Alesana attempted to capitalize on the pop punk elements entering the metal scene of the mid 2000s, a formula that would ultimately be perfected by the emergence of the crabcore band Attack Attack, and then achieve widespread success with Asking Alexandria. Metalcore bands that did not embrace the third wave elements and turned towards a heavier, progressive sound tended to espouse the more traditional punk message in their music. Era is a group that highlights this, characterized by their progressive djent sound, as well as incredibly complex lyrics. Their song Andromeda, which borrows directly from the Greek myth set in Ethiopia, perhaps shows this the best. The song takes the perspective of King Cepheus of Ethiopia and differs from the traditional narrative in that it is Andromeda herself who has brought the catastrophe of Poseidon's wrath upon Ethiopia through her own selfishness rather than that of her mother Cassiopeia's. The song's lyrics leave Cepheus lamenting for his daughter and the wrath she's brought upon him, with Andromeda having left to follow her own path. While initially unremarkable, the absence of Perseus rescuing and carrying off Andromeda to become his wife significantly changes the message of the story. Instead of being the damsel in distress, Andromeda is the rebellious daughter who forges her own path but destroys her relationship with her father in the process. Her actions sever herself from her home and she leaves Ethiopia in her own self-liberation. With Perseus absent, suddenly the song takes on the traditional punk message. Andromeda is our anti-establishment liberated hero of the story. Many can identify today with this set of circumstances represented by Era's portrayal of Cepheus and Andromeda, either in that not all relationships necessarily deserve to be repaired or that they simply can't be. I'm going to issue a content warning here because I will briefly be mentioning sexual assault and physical violence, physical assault, although not in detail. So if anybody has issues with that, please feel free to let one of the moderators know, or anything along that regard that makes you either feel comfortable or if you want to leave the conference briefly if it makes you uncomfortable. The metalcore scene has unfortunately remained disappointingly slow to progress in regard to the portrayal and treatment of women, despite the fact that the scene has referred specifically to the metalcore scene, which developed out of the rejection of the misogynistic heavy hardcore scene. The narrative of Andromeda in this regard is a rare exception to the themes of sexualization, betrayal, revenge, and domination in relationships that can be found in the majority of metalcore songs, to the point where many are even labeled cringecore. A Dance with Aracura, a song by Miss May I, named after the early Latin goddess found in Roman culture, yet having little to actually do with her own mythos, is one such example. This ties hand in hand with the reality of the culture of the scene itself, with major festivals such as Warped Tour rife with sexual exploitation and the grooming of minors by many band members, which has been brought back to light with the Me Too movement after Attack Attacks and other prolific bands' warnings about this problem were ignored in the late 2000s. Even today, with prolific female artists such as Courtney LaPlante of I Wrestled a Bear Once and Spiritbox fame, Tatiana Shmyluk of Ginger, who I might note due to recent events, I believe is in the Ukraine, or Connie Sgarbosa of CU Space Cowboy. Women in the genre face major hurdles. While this problem is inherent to the origins of the scene itself and the metalcore genre as a whole, it was likely prolonged by the impact the American evangelical movement had on metalcore in the mid-2000s. In the first decade of the 21st century, a new wave of evangelical Christianity gripped the United States. Many children spent their summers at Bible camps watching VeggieTales and reading moralizing adaptations of biblical literature, while teens found themselves in youth groups and youth bands. This wave of evangelicalism gripped the metal scene, particularly in Ohio, which gave rise to a number of prominent second wave metalcore bands whose evangelical lyrics resulted in the mocking label of Christcore. While many faded into obscurity, chief among these successes were bands such as Under Oath, As I Lay Dying, and The Devil Wears Prada. While caving to a mainstream evangelical movement does not seem characteristically punk, The Devil Wears Prada managed to defy many norms of evangelical thoughts in their lyrics, particularly in number 3, Never Forget, on their second album, Plagues. The song number 3, Never Forget, starts out as a direct criticism of Christianity with its opening line, "You've compromised your doctrines." Protestant and American evangelical Christianity are well known to be non-doctrinal, with teachings that contradict several ecumenical councils, as well as the fundamental establishment of an apostolic and Catholic church by the Council of Nicaea in 324. At first glance, one would think that promoting an adherence to the structured doctrines and organization of Orthodox Christianity would be counterintuitive to a punk message, as the genre is traditionally anti-authoritarian and disestablishmentarian. However, fundamentally, punk is also nonconformist, and The Devil Wears Prada uses doctrinal Christianity to criticize the conformist mainstream evangelical Christian movement sweeping across Ohio in their youth. In that regard, it is a brilliant espousal of the rejection of the mainstream characteristic of the punk genre. The song, however, does not stop there, continuing with lyrics such as "the blood relationship creates such a rotten demise" and "such blackness portrays the love of a machine" to describe the evangelical movement. Both lyrics are themes of doctrinal early and medieval Christianity, with the development of ideological blackness in late and post-Roman periods, and the fundamental nature of communion as a blood oath derived from Roman funerary and death cults. Machines and the mechanistic nature of social movements are a common trope in the lyrics of the punk and metal genres, and its combination with theological doctrine by Prada is particularly poignant in espousing traditional punk thought, with mainstream evangelism being a hypocritical machine to deceive, chew up, and spit out the believer rather than bring them closer to God. Fundamentally and finally, the title of the song itself is an allusion to both early Christian theological doctrine and also to extra biblical, apocryphal, and magical writings. The number 3 is a magical number both in biblical and extra biblical literature, such as the so-called Greek magical papyri. Names of archangels and Gnostic spells are often evoked in threes. Numerous things throughout the Bible itself are mentioned in 3 times or grouped in threes. And of course, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity itself is an enshrining of this magic number. Once more, Prada is reminding the listener that Christianity is a mystic, doctrinal religion deeply rooted in classical traditions, thought, and cultural phenomena. Despite the particularities of the messaging of number 3, The Devil Wears Prada's early works were still a part of a theme of moralizing Christian messaging that dominated the metalcore scene in the 2000s and early 2010s. And again, the earlier content warning applies here if you would like to tune out again. So I'll just give you a moment to consider that. Bands like As I Lay Dying or Of Mice and Men played more heavily into this theme, much to their own hypocrisy with the exposure of sexual predators within these groups, such as Austin Carlisle or Tim Lambesis' attempted solicitation of his wife's murder. Lambesis' personal research into the classical and medieval origins of Christianity was noted throughout the court cases revolving around his divorce and later attempted murder of his spouse, although the resulting actions certainly cannot be attributed to it. The themes of female subservience and submissiveness, rampant sexual predation, and other numerous issues interlaced among both evangelical youth programs and Christcore bands have no doubt been a major factor in diminishing the role of women and prolonging the fight to overcome sexism within the metalcore scene. Conversely, the messaging of partycore bands like Attila, named after the famous Hunnic emperor who has been the subject of much of my own research, and fronted by serial assailant, and I mean physical, as in he committed multiple assaults, and aspiring pornographic film star Chris Franzak, does not help in this regard. While there is an abundance of classical influence within the metalcore genre, the genre itself has rarely succeeded in using it to espouse the fundamental themes of metalcore. Bands which tend to more accurately embrace authentic punk and feminist messaging, such as I See Stars or Knocked Loose, rarely make use of classical themes, although occasionally they pop up in titles such as Ouroboros as an overused metaphor by CU Space Cowboy or The Odyssey by Adestria. Instead, classical literature or classical history within the genre has heavily tied into lyrics and bands which have promoted misogynistic or religious messaging. That being said, there is a sliver of hope for classical history and the metalcore genre. For example, an entire paper could be written on Above Below's adaptation of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy and their debut EP, The Sowers of Discord. A handful of bands such as Trivium have also begun to take the Sabaton approach and retelling classical history through musical lyrics, albeit with the usual criticisms that method entails. In conclusion, this introductory overview of the classical world and the metalcore scene shows that there is much need for research and study of the metalcore genre and its use of the ancient and medieval world. And how much time do I have left, Amanda?
I was just gonna message 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm gonna briefly show a clip from Alesana then. Give me a sec. Yeah.
Il reste que 2 minutes.
So
Après ça, notre.
Ouais, c'est tout qu'à 21h, ça enchaîne.
let me share screen real quick. So this is a clip from a post-hardcore more so than a metalcore song by the band Alesana from 2006. I don't know if there's volume. Is there volume, Amanda?
I can't hear the audio
Okay,
myself.
that's fine. That's fine. Don't worry about it. But you can clearly see some of the tropes I was talking about with the nice guy who's features as the main character of this story. And in a few seconds here, we'll get into the relation to King Midas. So you can see the garden turns to gold after this point. And in just a sec, after it shows the woman walking away, okay, I'm gonna skip ahead. But here it shows him thrashing in the water after a golden rain falls, which is a reference to the bathing in the river Patroclus. And I'm gonna stop it here since I'm out of time. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to either post them in the chat or let me figure out how to oh, here we go, stop share. Feel free to post them to in the chat or ask verbally.
Could you share your video link? Oops, sorry, Evan, in the chat.
Oh, yes.
So questions need to be sent to Amanda personally in the chat rather than put in the general chat. That's just the way that we're doing this to make sure that we can keep track of everything because we've got a lot of people, otherwise it'll go a bit mad. So if you've got questions, send them to Amanda and she'll work through them as much as she can in 10 minutes.
And great job, Evan.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much for being our first person.
Well, Evan, one question is, can people email you later if they have questions?
Yes, I believe is my email in the biographic on the page, or?
I have your biographic open at the moment, and I do not see your email in a biographic on the page.
I will,
Evan, I'll post it in the chat. Just you can keep the Q&A going.
Okay.
Okay. Is there anyone else with questions? Please DM me or put them in the chat and I will read them. Well, I have a question. I'll ask while everyone else is thinking of one to put in the chat, because I've written briefly on As I Lay Dying for my chapter in Jasmine Shadrack's monograph on Black metal trauma, subjectivity, and sound. What do you think we as a community should do, Evan, when people like that pop up in it? Like, how should we police? How do you think we should police our own?
Well, that came up very recently. When I say recently, I say 2020 because the last 2 years have blurred together. But when Austin Carlisle's the cases of sexual assault against minors by Austin Carlisle reemerged. He was originally kicked out of the band Attack Attack in 2007, who left him crying in a Utah parking lot for that. And they warned everybody. And there was a big debate over Out Press apparently covering up an article about this in June of 2020. When the allegations came back out against him. And the metalcore community responded overall pretty positively. Caleb Shomo, the former lead singer of Attack Attack, and his wife both were very insistent on a formal investigation into the allegations, along with many other metalcore bands, including all of the former all of Mice and Men, who was Austin Carlisle's former band. And so this was obviously a serious issue, and the metalcore community has come together and has progressed a lot in recent years, with the Me Too movement, especially to uncover cases like this, because that was not the only case that came out. It was the one that sparked a slew of allegations against bands like Issues, and I think even one of the members of, I don't know if this allegation was true, but I think one of the members of A Day to Remember even, within the community. So a bunch of bands suddenly started having these cases exposed where young women were being predated upon or groomed, among the other issues. Obviously, Tim Lambesis' attempted murder of his wife was a big one back in 2014. And you also have cases like, as I mentioned, Franz and Ronnie Radke, who threw a mic stand at a performer, or not a performer, sorry, an audience member, or committed assault. And the community is improving. It's improving in its policing of itself. And hopefully in the next few years, as things continue to accelerate, my apologies, with a more progressive movement and a more feminist, I guess pro-feminist approach in many ways, things will get better.
Thank you, Evan. There's 3 more questions that I have. Oh, 4. This one is from Shama. So are you suggesting there's a connection between the choice of using classical tropes and metalcore with misogynistic themes?
Yes, very much. Like I said, Alesana very much adapted it to a very much sort of nice guy message. Songs like that are not uncommon. There are much more vulgar ones, particularly by Capture the Crown is probably the most extreme example I can think of from a third wave metalcore band, without getting into some of the micro genres that are even more extreme in that regard. A lot of Attila's messaging is Asking Alexandria, which is a band whose name isn't supposed to be related to the Library of Alexandria, but many of their songs are very misogynistic. Um, and the genre has largely moved on from those types of lyrics, but they're still there. In a lot of smaller bands, the genre as a whole has moved towards more of that progressive djent sound, and messaging bands like Spirit Box and Era use, but it's still a problem. Classical themes were used to espouse a misogynistic message. Classical topics were, and there's very much the potential for it to continue to happen as bands continue to draw from ancient and medieval history.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. This next one is from Peter. Peter's struck by the preference and these reception of myth that you've been talking about to make them romantic / love stories and image. Are there any other instances of making myths romantic through lyrical adaptations or instances of removing romantic undertones?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any instances of removing the romantic undertones except the song by Era, because they definitely remove the damsel in distress narrative with Perseus rescuing Andromeda and then making her his wife. But there's very much a lot of cases of, I mean, the whole romantic undertone and all the subliminal messaging that comes with that is just characteristic of pop punk and metal and third wave metalcore, which fused together in 2006 through 2009, basically. And there's a lot more. I'd have to go through my song list and find you specific examples, to be honest. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but I can assure you there's plenty more examples.
Okay, thank you. Someone posted a follow-up to a question, but this is the next one, so it's good that they did a follow-up right away. This is from Gulharm. I have a question for Evan. Evan, do you think this appropriation of classical themes comes from a common Christian background shared by the members of these bands, or from individual preferences of its members? And then the follow-up to that is, are these classical images and tropes construed within the evangelical discourses in the United States?
So the answer is both, I want to say, because if you look at Attila, for example, they came across Attila the Hun in a book in a bookstore, literally. And that's where they got the inspiration for their band name. So you have a mix of people who are just out of personal preference or coincidence or whatever other way are coming to using classical themes and tropes because they like the myth, they like the story, the character, etc. And then you definitely have separately, but also in some ways tied together, the evangelical Christian movement, which influenced so much bands in the first decade of the 2000s in Ohio, where most of the second and third wave metalcore bands came out of. That heavily influenced their messaging. There are so many particularly smaller Christcore bands that faded into obscurity, where you can certainly look through them and find more messages about early Christianity or doctrinal Christianity, or even, but most of them espouse evangelical themes and lyrics. Most of them are definitely espousing sort of the mainstream youth group lyrics that are going around, either in diverging from directly talking about God, but keeping the themes, or many do just straight up make straight references to Jesus and God. Stick Stickly, actually, by Attack Attack, which was linked earlier, is literally a song about Jesus dying on the cross, which is one of the reasons why it was so poorly received initially, before it was seen today as revolutionary within the genre.